over 1,000 feet below the height of the surrounding terrain, in clouds and with no clue that they're heading straight towards a mountain.
Terrain ahead.
Stay tuned. Have you ever heard the phrase rubbish in, rubbish out? Well, this refers to when you enter something faulty into a computer, which then causes you to get something equally faulty back. And in the world of aviation, with its ever more complicated computer systems, this holds a special significance. Back in 1995, one of the deadliest disasters involving a US carrier took place when the crew of American Airlines Flight 965 failed to spot that they had programmed the wrong waypoint into their flight management computer. This was a single innocuous error, but one that led the aircraft onto a track towards high terrain without the pilots even noticing it. Until it was too late. Now, the aviation industry learned a very hard lesson on that day. So after that, strict confirmations of waypoints and computer inputs have been drilled into all pilots. So that should mean that a similar accident shouldn't be possible today, right? Well, this brings us to today's story, which took place on the 10th of November 2016. This day was supposed to have been a standby duty for the two involved pilots, but late in the afternoon on the 9th of November, the Wizz Air operations controller had called them up and informed them that they would need to operate 4 flights on the following day. The first of those flights was going to be a positioning or ferry flight from Budapest in Hungary over to Nice in Serbia. And these kinds of ferry flights are occasionally required when an aircraft needs to be brought from one airport to another for technical or operational reasons. What it means is that basically the pilots will position the aircraft themselves and sometimes their cabin crew without any passengers, and this can often lead to a more relaxed atmosphere on board. So when the pilots eventually turned up to their crew room in Budapest on the 13th of November, they likely looked forward to this first flight. It's always fun to do something slightly different. Now, neither of them had flown to Nice airport before, so when they started going through the pre-flight material, they probably looked a bit closer at the arrival and approach charts to try to figure out what they could expect, as well as, of course, the overall weather and NOTAMs. But everything looked reasonably straightforward. So when they were happy with the preparation, they just went over to brief their 4 cabin crew colleagues who were likely also looking forward to a very relaxed start of their day. Now, as they all walked out to the aircraft, a shiny Airbus A320-200, the pilots decided that the first officer was going to be pilot flying for this first ferry flight leg, and the captain would therefore be pilot monitoring. But this makes sense to me, as they were flying to a new destination, and when you're a captain, it's always nice to do that as pilot monitoring, because that gives a better overview of the general operation and enables you to spot any potential issues early and then plan for them. Or at least that's the idea. Now, there might of course be situations where the captain have to be pilot flying, especially if the runway is short or there are other operational limitations, but this was not the case here, even though the approach looked a little bit tricky. When they entered the cockpit, the captain first checked the technical status of the aircraft, which was perfectly fine. There was no technical issues open, so he quickly then went outside to start the walk around while the first officer started setting up the cockpit. As he was doing so, one of the flight attendants asked if she could stay in the cockpit for the flight, and the pilot agreed. Or maybe it was the other way around and it was the pilot who asked. We don't really know for sure. But this is not unusual on positioning flights, since it gives the cabin crew an opportunity to both enjoy the views from the flight deck, but also to get a better understanding of the workload that the pilots are facing during different phases of flight, something that is otherwise pretty hidden nowadays behind the locked cockpit door. For us pilots, it's also nice to get a chance to talk to our cabin crew colleagues a bit, something that short-haul pilots rarely get a chance to do nowadays. But it can also create an environment which can become a little bit too relaxed and therefore lead to distractions if it's not managed well. So, who were the pilots of this flight then? Well, the captain was 62 years old and very experienced. He had flown over 22,000 hours in total, with nearly 5,500 on those on the Airbus A320 family. On this day, he said that he felt all right, but that he had not gotten much quality sleep during the previous night, so he also felt a little bit tired. His co-pilot was 49 years old and also relatively experienced, with nearly 5,000 hours of total time and just over 2,000 hours on the Airbus A320 and 321. He had just returned back from some annual leave and had therefore not flown at all during the preceding 10 days. But he was feeling great, and maybe that fact, the fact that he was feeling rested, was another reason for him to fly the first leg. In any case, the pilots continued to set up the aircraft according to their standard procedures. The first officer completed the departure briefing, and after that they would have briefed their cabin crew colleague on how to use the jump seat, headset and oxygen mask, something that we have to do every time that we have someone traveling on the jump seat. After everyone was ready, the first officer asked for pushback and startup clearance, and once that was received, Wizz Air Flight 801 pushed back, started its engines and was soon on its way out towards the runway. Everything was running smoothly as the aircraft continued to taxi out, and they had soon lined up on the runway and received their takeoff clearance. The first officer then set takeoff thrust, the aircraft started accelerating and proceeded for a normal takeoff. They were now on their way towards Nice, climbing like a rocket due to the aircraft's low weight without passengers. Now, before we go any further, it's worth explaining a little bit more about the destination that these pilots were now flying towards. Nice, Constantine the Great Airport, is the second largest airport in Serbia. It's situated in the southern part of the country near the Stara Planina, or Old Mountains, which form part of the western end of the Balkan mountain range, right on the border between Serbia and Bulgaria. And that is one of the biggest threats at Nice, the very high terrain surrounding the airport, as it's actually situated in kind of a valley. While the elevation of the runway is only 650 feet, it is surrounded on nearly all sides by very high terrain, with minimum sector altitude, MSAs, reaching as high as 7,000 feet. The MSAs is altitudes that are highlighted on our navigational charts, and they always gives a minimum terrain clearance of 1,000 feet, and it's one of those things that we pilots have to be constantly aware of. Now, if you're on an instrument flight plan, which all big aircraft are, you can of course descend below the MSA, but only if you're following a pre-approved track or procedure. And the high terrain around this airport meant that accurate track keeping was really important. Because of this, all the arrivals, approach and missed approach procedures into Nice were planned with strict altitude constraints, and that's worth keeping in mind. Now, the risk of flying into mountains might not be a very high concern for you, but something that I definitely think should be is the risk of your personal data being bought and sold for malicious use. You might not realize it, but every day your personal information like your name, home, email address and even your browsing habits are being auctioned out online by companies known as data brokers, and that's actually what's causing most spam emails, robocalls and phishing attempts. This is completely legal, believe it or not, but that also means that you have the right to opt out of it. The problem is that it's a royal pain to contact all of these brokers individually and then stay on top of them, so this is where today's sponsor Incogni comes in. Once you have signed up with Incogni, they will take care of all of this for you, so you can just sit back, relax and look at their dashboard as the digital army starts chasing these companies down. When I first signed up, I was really stunned by just the sheer number of companies that were selling my data, and so far Incogni have already sent out over 110 requests and completed 94 takedowns. Awesome. So if you want to take back control of your personal data, then give Incogni a try by clicking on my special link here below, which is incogni.com/pilot. If you do that and then use the code PILOT, you'll get a whopping 60% discount off their annual plan. Thank you, Incogni. Now, let's continue. Remember, I was just talking about the importance of keeping track of all minimum en route altitudes when we're flying. Another thing that will become really important soon is a system that you might have heard me talking about in some of my other videos, the Enhanced Ground Proximity Warning System, or EGPWS. This system is super clever and likely one of the most safety-enhancing things that have been fitted to aircraft lately. It utilizes a database called WGS84 along with input from the Global Positioning System to make sure it always knows exactly where the aircraft is in relation to surrounding terrain, obstacles and man-made structures. It can provide a range of warnings and cautions to crew in order to alert them if, for example, the aircraft comes too close to the ground while having the landing gear in the incorrect position, or if the flap configuration is not correctly set. It can also do the same if the aircraft fails to achieve a positive climb after takeoff or if its sink rate on approach is too high. In addition to alerts, the EGPWS system can also provide terrain information, which can be selected to overlay the navigation display and show a kind of picture of the terrain around the aircraft. In that setting, it color coordinates terrain to show anything below the aircraft as green, or if it's really far below, black, anything between the same level to 1,000 feet above as low-density yellow blocks, anything above that as high-density yellow, and terrain more than 2,000 feet above as red. Now the pilots must choose between showing either the weather radar or terrain display, since both can't be shown on the same screen simultaneously, and when operating in areas with high terrain, like Nice Airport in this case, it's generally a good idea for one pilot to have terrain display than for the other to have the weather radar. Now Airbus uses a Honeywell EGPWS, which contains 6 different modes which are worth knowing about. The first 5 modes provide cautions and warnings for excessive descent rate, excessive terrain closure rate, altitude loss after takeoff or go-around, unsafe terrain clearance when not in landing configuration, and excessive deviation below the glide slope. And the 6th mode just provides advisory callouts like bank angle and minimums. But the one that will become really interesting in this story is mode number 2, excessive terrain closure rate. This mode includes cautions like
Terrain,
which changes to
pull up,
warnings if the aircraft comes within the warning range. And here comes a difference between the old GPWS, which the crew in the Cali accident had, and the enhanced system, which we're talking about here. You see, in the enhanced system, it doesn't just react to terrain, it can also look ahead, effectively predicting a conflict and therefore providing a much greater alerting time. It does this by projecting ribbons ahead of the aircraft, which shows where the aircraft will be during the coming minutes with its current trajectory and speed. It then compares this progress prediction with its terrain database, and if that prediction shows that the ribbons will risk running into terrain, well then it starts issuing an alert. The caution alert typically sounds when the aircraft is predicted to be around 40 to 60 seconds away from impact, and the pull-up warning then sounds approximately 30 seconds before. 30 seconds is still not a lot of time, but because it's based on a forward-looking predictive function, it should be enough if the correct responses are followed. Now, once the aircraft had reached its cruising altitude, the crew relaxed a bit. They then completed their paperwork, and it's fair to assume that the atmosphere on board was quite relaxed and pleasant at this point, possibly with the cockpit door open and with more cabin crew coming in and visiting. But as the aircraft eventually started approaching the top of descent, the crew started to concentrate and prepare for the arrival with the expected terrain threats fresh in their minds. It was particularly important to do a thorough brief here, since neither of the pilots had ever operated into this airport before. Now, without experience of the airport and what clearances air traffic control might give them, the crew decided to set up the arrival and approach suggested on their flight plan, the SOSEC 1 Romeo Alpha arrival. And after having checked the weather, they also saw that runway 11 was in use with a VOR approach. Now, the Airbus A320 has an FMC, a flight management computer, in which the crew can program the route and also things like the expected arrival and approach procedure. So the crew here just selected the SOSEC 1 Romeo Alpha arrival and then added the VOR 11 approach from the approach drop-down menu. The FMC also gives an option of selecting a transition or via point. And for the SOSEC 1 Romeo Alpha, the November India Sierra Navade was the final point before transitioning into the procedural VOR approach, so they likely would have selected this as well. Now, when we're using the FMC programmed arrivals and approaches, the Compact Display Unit, or CDU, also shows any relevant speeds and altitude constraints coded into those procedures. For example, in this case, the requirement was to be at or above 4,300 feet until passing Ribar, Lamov, and a navade called Juliet Sierra Tango. And once selected, this information would have also been visible on their navigation displays. Now, when everything was set up, the pilots also spent some time discussing potential threats for the approach, including the fact that the VOR glide path was steeper than usual, which might require them to configure early to get the speed down, and also the fact that this was a non-precision approach, which always requires higher concentration, diligence, and adherence to procedures. Now, including potential threats in the briefing is a relatively recent concept. Because it's been found that by visualizing and coming up with strategies for dealing with anticipated threats, many errors can be avoided and crews become generally more resilient. This is similar to you planning for a busy traffic situation and therefore leaving your house earlier for work, but at a much bigger scale. Now, the VR approach into runway 11 in this case also involved something known as a procedural turn, starting at November India Sierra VOR and then turning via Lamov to Ribar and to the final approach point at Juliet Sierra Tango. With the SOSEC 1 Romeo Alpha arrival, the crew would have had to fly this whole procedure, but there was actually a better arrival available for them, which would lead them in a straight line towards Ribar and Juliet Sierra Tango for a straight-in approach. This approach was called SOSEC 2 Alpha, but since the crew were unfamiliar with the airport, they just went with whatever was in their flight plan instead. Now, it is worth pointing out here that there was also a transition from the Juliet Sierra Tango and the B beacon on that arrival to allow entrance into the VR approach from other directions as well, and that Juliet Sierra Tango transition will soon become important. But the crew likely didn't spend so much time looking at different arrivals because, like I mentioned before, there was also additional threats with this approach, including the fact that the approach was steeper than normal, but also that the inbound course on the approach was 115 degrees, but the runway direction was 109 degrees, meaning an offset by 6 degrees. That might not sound like a lot, but it would have meant that the runway would not be directly in front of them when they became visual, and they would therefore also require to do some late-stage maneuvering. So the pilots discussed how they intended to fly all of this and would have covered elements like how and when they would slow down and configure the aircraft, if the weather was okay for the approach, and what they expected to see once visual. But that brings up the question, what was the weather like? Well, while the conditions on the ground was relatively good, with only light and variable winds, a QNH of 1013 and a temperature of 6 degrees Celsius, higher up the picture was slightly different. There were several layers of clouds at altitude, which would obscure the view of the terrain, so during the descent the crew would be flying almost entirely inside of cloud, preventing any visual orientation at all, and that's also worth keeping in mind. Anyway, the crew soon received clearance from the area controller to start the descent down towards the destination, and soon they also approached SOSEC, which was the starting point for their arrival procedure. But when they were almost over that point, the controller suddenly called them up and cleared them to follow the SOSEC 2 Alpha arrival instead of the SOSEC 1 Romeo Alpha. Now, as I mentioned before, this was actually a better routing for them overall, but it was not the one that they had actually briefed. It isn't uncommon that there are several arrivals starting from the same point and going to the same runway. The reason for that is that the different ones can then be used depending on which nav aids are working or for traffic separation purposes, and if you find yourself having programmed and briefed one arrival and then you are suddenly cleared for another, you can always try to make your life easy by asking the controller if you can fly the one that you've planned for, and they might actually approve that. But if that's not possible, or like in this case it would mean a significantly longer routing, well then it's super important that the pilots enter the new arrival into the flight management computer, checks it thoroughly, and then brief it all over again, since both the routing and the altitude restrictions can be very different. But in this case, the crew seemed to be in a little bit of a hurry, so they just entered the new arrival into the FMC and executed it, without ever going through and briefing it properly. And that's even though they had plenty of time to do so at this point. Now, if they would have looked at it, they would have noticed that the SOSEC 2 Alpha would, like I mentioned before, bring the aircraft in on a more direct routing via Ribar and then towards the Juliet Sierra Tango NDB for the approach. But do you remember the Juliet Sierra Tango transition that I talked about earlier? Well, this transition created a procedural turn from Juliet Sierra Tango via a point called NIS 308, Ribar, and then back to Juliet Sierra Tango. But from the direction that flight 801 was now coming, there was no reason to fly that. They were already coming from Ribar directly towards Juliet Sierra Tango and could therefore proceed straight in for the approach. But that procedure turn was still in there as an option, and when the pilots just quickly entered this new arrival, reselected the approach via Juliet Sierra Tango and then executed, it stayed in there. If they would have selected the no via option instead, that would have solved the problem. Remember? Rubbish in, rubbish out. Now the minimum altitude that all aircraft had to maintain until reaching Juliet Sierra Tango was 4,300 feet. This was true both from the direction of rebar and for the procedure turn after Juliet Sierra Tango if coming from the other direction. The earliest time anyone could descend from 4,300 feet was after passing Juliet Sierra Tango and established on the 115-degree final inbound track towards the VOR. And that is going to be very important soon. The pilots continued to descend according to the minimum altitudes on the arrival, and after they passed the rebar, they should have set 4,300 feet, which was the platform altitude for the VOR approach. But instead, the first officer now selected 1,000 feet in open descent, which caused the aircraft to start descending below the minimum altitude, way too early. He didn't mention this mode change to the captain, which is a serious breach of procedures, especially when flying in mountainous terrain, but luckily the captain quite quickly realized this error and told him to immediately climb back up to 4,300 feet again. Now we don't know why this mistake happened, but 1,000 feet was their minimum descent altitude on the VOR approach, rounded up from 970 feet, and it is possible that the first officer, being a little bit stressed about the coming steep offset approach, simply made a mistake here, and it wouldn't be the last one. This hiccup would have likely increased the workload for the first officer, since the real descent point, Juliet Sierra Tango, was less than 3 nautical miles away when this happened, and this might also have had an impact on what happened next. As the aircraft passed Juliet Sierra Tango, the first officer expected to now finally be able to start descending down towards the airport. There were a lot of other configurations that also needed to be made, and all of this would have formed part of the mental picture he now had for the approach ahead. But here, something completely baffling happened. The aircraft suddenly started turning left. Now, of course, it did so because of the route that was loaded into the flight management computer, but the first officer who was flying did not want that to happen. So he now pulled out the heading track button to take control over the direction manually and keep the aircraft continuing straight ahead. And he also quickly initiated a descent down towards 1,200 feet. The captain, who had caught the earlier altitude mistake the first officer had made, now told him to instead allow the aircraft to complete the full procedure turn. In his view, they had already deviated from the approach radial at this point, so he likely thought that, although annoying, a turn wouldn't be a disaster and they could just start the approach once they reached the NDB again after the turn. But somehow, he missed that the first officer had also started descending. Remember, the minimum altitude was 4,300 feet until passing the Juliet Sierra Tango NDB inbound on the approach, and that was for very good reasons. There were several high mountains in this area, including a peak of 3,152 feet quite close to the approach track. Now, instead of allowing the first officer, who was still pilot flying, to take care of the turn, the captain instead intervened and simply turned the heading bug around himself and then re-engaged the lateral navigation. And as he was doing that, the first officer was simultaneously reducing the descent rate from 1,100 feet per minute to 700. I would just like to point out here that it's never a good idea to have both pilots inputting on the flight controls or the mode control panel at any point. It's super important that we keep to our designated areas of responsibility in order to avoid confusion of who is in control, and this is especially true when the first officer is pilot flying, as the captain overriding can cause the first officer to completely lose initiative and situational awareness. So what was now happening was that the two pilots had two completely different views on how to solve their current situation. The captain wanted to complete the turn whilst maintaining 4,300 feet until over the Juliet Sierra Tango again, whilst the first officer had intended to just manually continue inbound and therefore started to descend. And the result was the worst possible combination of those two plans. At an altitude of only 2,200 feet, the aircraft was on a heading of 158 degrees to rejoin the track towards Juliet Sierra Tango, but that also meant that they now had a huge mountain towering 1,000 feet above and ahead of them. At this point, the captain must have suddenly realized that the aircraft wasn't maintaining its altitude, and he therefore called out, "Why are we descending?" whilst also telling the first officer to immediately go around and start turn left. But by this point, they had descended even further, down to 1,880 feet, and they were now so close to the mountain that the enhanced ground proximity warning system activated and started blaring out,
Terrain ahead. Pull up.
Now when that warning is heard, there is a very clear procedure that must be followed immediately and without hesitation, and that's known as the terrain escape maneuver. In the Airbus, that maneuver includes turning the autopilot off, pitch, pull to full backstick, thrust levers full toga, speed brakes verified down, and bank wings level or adjust. It's super important that the pilot flying execute these items immediately from memory, and it's the job of the pilot monitoring to make sure that everything is done correctly, to monitor the aircraft's performance and to call out any tendencies towards terrain. But what instead happened here was that as the captain called for the first officer to go around and to climb, the first officer reacted by engaging the autopilot in full climb, even though the autopilot should be immediately disconnected in this case. And after that, both pilots started pulling back on their respective side sticks. But none of them moved the thrust levers into the toga detent, so the thrust just stayed in normal climb as instructed by the autopilot and the auto thrust. Again, following standard procedures and adhering to designated roles would have likely captured these mistakes, but a feeling of panic was now starting to spread, and with that, the communication was also breaking down even further, meaning that the thrust was left unchanged. Now, when two pilots pulled back on their side sticks at the same time without anyone taking priority, the Airbus's fly-by-wire system will take both of those inputs into account. In this case, this meant that the nose of the aircraft rapidly rose to a pitch up of almost 21 degrees. And what happens if the nose attitude is suddenly increased without full thrust selected? Yes, the speed now started washing off at the same time as the angle of attack also started rising. Now, remember how I mentioned the American Airlines Cali accident earlier on and how they had been tricked to fly towards a mountain due to a mistake they had made in their FMC? Well, that's very similar to what had happened here, and now the similarities became almost eerie as this crew also initially mishandled the terrain escape maneuver. But this is where decades of technical advancements finally came to the pilot's aid. Because not only did this crew get their terrain warning significantly earlier than the crew of American Airlines Flight 965, they also had the awesome protections of the Airbus A320 at their disposal. You see, the Airbus contains numerous protections known as hard protections, and those are non-overridable actions taken by the autoflight system to keep the aircraft within a safe flight envelope, and they are available as long as the aircraft is operating in normal law. One of these protections is known as alpha floor, and it kicks in when the speed of the aircraft starts to fall below the minimum selectable airspeed together with a high angle of attack. All of this was happening in this case due to the extremely high pitch angle combined with a turn away from the terrain and a dropping airspeed. When this is sensed, one of the things that happens is that it causes an auto-engagement of maximum toga thrust, and it then locks that thrust in using something known as toga lock. This function will, as the name suggests, keep the thrust output in toga until the crew unlocks it by disengaging the auto throttle. So as these pilots were now pitching up and turning with the speed dropping, the aircraft itself actually gave them full thrust, despite them not initially setting it. Now they did eventually move the thrust levers into the toga detent, but at that stage, toga lock had already engaged and it would have been visible on their FMAs in their primary flight displays. And as we will see, this was soon going to give them a whole new problem. You see, having gone from a potential controlled flight into terrain event, where aside from a loss of situational awareness, the pilot had at least been in control of the aircraft, they now started to really fall behind the airplane, which essentially meant that instead of them flying the airplane was now flying them. Throughout this whole ordeal, the crew had not been in contact with the NIS approach controller. The last time that he had heard anything from them was when they read back their approach clearance. But now they called him up again, explaining that they had gone around. The controller responded and asked the crew to maintain the go-around altitude of 4,300 feet, but at this stage that altitude was already well below them. Now they overshot that missed approach altitude, likely because of a combination of their very low weight and the fact that they were prioritizing the terrain escape maneuver, which I completely understand. But once they felt sure that the terrain was no longer a factor, the first officer started to lower the nose to try and level off. And what do you think happened then? Yes, since the auto throttle was still in toga lock, it didn't matter that the crew pulled the thrust levers back, the engines would just keep producing maximum thrust until the pilots fully disengaged the auto thrust. And an interesting tidbit here is that toga lock actually would disengage on other Airbus types, but not on the Airbus A320. Anyway, this high thrust now caused the light aircraft to quickly accelerate, and it soon reached an astonishing speed of 331 knots, only 19 knots away from the maximum certified speed of the aircraft. At around 6,500 feet, the pilots finally managed to disengage the auto thrust and get the speed back under control, and around 30 seconds later they also managed to level off, reaching a maximum altitude of 7,640 feet. 3,340 feet above the cleared altitude and 81 knots faster than the highest speed allowed in this airspace. Fortunately though, there were no other aircraft in the airspace, so it didn't lead to any traffic conflict. But this is a great example of how quickly things can start to get out of hand when one mistake leads to another and strict cockpit discipline is not adhered to. On a private note, I also think at this point, yet again, to the problems with Airbus's idea of not having active side sticks and self-moving thrust levers to give tactile indications of what's happening to the pilots. In this case, again, both pilots were inputting on the controls at the same time, and even though toga lock was enunciated on their flight mode annunciator, it took a long while for the pilots to actually realize it. Something that would have been obvious if the thrust lever actually showed what the thrust was doing. On the other hand, the fantastic alpha floor protection and toga lock probably saved their bacon during the escape maneuver, so I will still lodge this as a win for the Airbus safety systems. Once the situation had calmed down a bit, the pilots rejoined the published missed approach procedure and descended back to 4,300 feet. After this, another procedural approach was flown, this time to a successful landing without any further incidents. But I'm guessing that the poor cabin crew on the jump seat probably had a few more grey hairs and also a few stories to tell her colleagues after this. Now the crew obviously reported this, but it took a few days for the authorities to realize just how serious of an incident this actually was. At that point, the cockpit voice recorder had already been lost, so this story is based on the flight data recordings, interviews and other retrievable data. The investigation found that the incident was caused by the incorrectly executed re-cleared arrival route, which had not been properly briefed by the pilots. This then led them to descend at the wrong point, directly towards terrain, which was followed by an incorrectly executed terrain escape maneuver and subsequent level and speed busts. The root cause for all of this was inadequate communication and work distribution between the pilots, which led to a loss of situational awareness as the emergency escalated. And on top of that, the pilots were not always aware of what the automatics were doing, and all of this was made worse by the weather, the low weight of the aircraft, and possibly also by some distractions caused by having another person in the cockpit. But what I think was left out here was the obvious onset of something known as the startle effect. That's what happens when something genuinely unexpected happens, which quickly raises the stress level and often leads to a few seconds of surprise inaction before we start doing something. And when we do, it's super important that we follow trained procedures, because if not, mistakes like this can easily happen. Now, it's super hard to train startle response, especially in the simulator, since it often becomes very obvious that we are setting a crew up for a terrain escape maneuver, for example. And therefore, real startle is often experienced for the first time in an actual, real situation. That's why diligent training of procedures, high technical knowledge and strict cockpit discipline is so important. Now, Wizz Air took this incident seriously and reviewed their training syllabus regarding terrain escape maneuvers, non-precision approaches and adherence to cockpit areas of responsibilities. Information about this event was then sent out to all pilots in the company to make sure that everyone can learn from it, and the involved pilots received some extra training and was then allowed back on the line again. And this is exactly how this industry stays as safe as it is. You see, mistakes will happen. We're all human, but as long as there is honesty and transparency, it shouldn't lead to disciplinary procedures. Instead, we can all learn from it and hopefully avoid similar mistakes in the future. Now, this video was made possible by my fabulous team and the support we are all getting from the members of my Patreon crew. If you want to see these videos early and help produce them, then join my crew by going to patreon.com/join/mentorpilot or click on the link in the description below. Have an absolutely fantastic day wherever you are, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.